Borders. Sheeran's small park seemed pretty big to me in the gathering darkness. I don't know whether it was a park that had gone to seed or had been designed that way, as a miniature wilderness with sketchy paths, no lights, and occasional bench. I'm not an expert on parks or on wildernesses. We trekked on for 10 minutes or so, then settled on a bench, with the trees blocking out what little light was left in the sky. It might as well have been midnight. Borders are always tricky, intriguing things, B said at last. Feral children fascinate because they stand at the border of the animal world. Gorillas and dolphins fascinate because they stand at the border of the human world. Even though they're only arbitrary consequences of the fact that we use a decimal numeration system, the borders between centuries and millennia fascinate. Shakespeare's fools fascinate because they live at the border between sanity and madness. The heroes of tragedy fascinate because they walk the border between triumph and defeat. The borders between pre-human and human, between childhood and adulthood, between generations, between nations and peoples, between social and political paradigms, all of these are intensely fascinating. The border that Charles and I have been trying to focus your attention on is the border that was crossed when one group of people living in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago became us. You know that crossing this border brought us to a very special sort of agriculture that produces enormous food surpluses. You know that crossing this border brought us to the most laborious lifestyle ever practiced on this planet. But these are superficial perceptions. Charles wanted you to see that this border represents a profoundly important spiritual and mental crossing. Charles tried to lead you to an appreciation of this crossing by leading you back to it from this side, from the present moment, but I'm going to take the opposite tack. I'll try to lead you to an appreciation of this crossing by leading you forward to it from the other side, from our origins in the community of life. I felt, rather than saw, her shiver. I think she must have felt my question in turns, for she said, "I'm not cold. I'm terrified." Why? Charles could have done this, would have done this next, but he hoped he wouldn't have had to. This is so much more difficult. The words "I'm sorry" were halfway out of my mouth, but I managed to hold them back. B stared into space for a few minutes, then said, "The fundamental taker delusion is that humanity itself was designed, and therefore destined, to become us. This is a twin of the idea that the entire universe was created in order to produce this planet. We would smile patronizingly if the Gibusi boasted that humanity was divinely destined to become Gibusi, but we're perfectly satisfied that humanity was divinely destined to become us. I think I'm beginning to see that, though I didn't see it the first time Charles said, 'We are not humanity.'" B nodded distantly, as if holding on to a tenuous thought. Because we imagine that we are what humanity was divinely destined to become, we assume that our prehistoric ancestors were trying to be us, but just lacked the tools and techniques to succeed. We invest our ancestors with our own predilections in what seems to us primitive and unevolved forms. As an example of all this, we must take it for granted that our religions represent humanity's ultimate and highest spiritual development, and expect to find among our ancestors only crude, fumbling harbingers of these religions. We certainly don't expect to find robust, fully developed religions whose expressions are entirely different from ours. Very true, I said. To what development do we trace the beginning of human religious thought? I'd say we trace the beginnings of human religious thought to the practice of burying the dead, which began 30 or 40,000 years ago. B nodded. This is just like tracing the beginning of human language to the practice of writing, which began about 5,000 years ago. I see what you mean, I think. It would never occur to a linguist to search for the origins of human language in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, would it? Certainly not, I said. Where would a linguist search for the origins of human language? I think he'd have to go back to the origins of human life itself. Because to be human is to have language? I'd say so. If Homo habilis didn't have language, then he's misnamed, doesn't deserve to be called Homo. I would say so. What is our hypothetical linguist's method going to be? I'd say it's going to be more philosophical and speculative than linguistic. He doesn't have an early human specimen whose language can be studied. He's going to be putting around in one of those fascinating borderlands, On one side of the border, man-like creatures without language, tool-using, as even modern chimpanzees are, but lacking what we mean by language. On the other side of the border, people. On the other side of the border, people. That's right, I said. But he's not going to study any clay tablets. No, not even for a minute. Good, because I don't intend to spend even a minute on the burial practices of the Upper Paleolithic. They're as irrelevant to the origins of religion as clay tablets are to the origins of language. I understand. Bricolage. The linguist and I must both practice bricolage, which is the craft of building with whatever comes to hand. It comes from the French bricoler, to putter about. We must both putter about in this strange borderland inhabited by almost humans on one side and truly humans on the other. So you assume that being human means being religious, just as the linguist assumes that being human means being lingual. Being a bricolier, I don't do anything as well defined as that, Jared. I poke around. I wonder if there's a dimension of thought that is inherently religious. I say to myself that perhaps thought is like a musical tone, which in nature is never a single pure note, but is always a composite of many harmonics, overtones, and undertones. And I say to myself that, perhaps, when mental process becomes human thought, it began to resound with one harmonic that corresponds to what we call religion, or, more fundamentally, awareness of the sacred. In other words, I wonder if awareness of the sacred is not so much a separate concept as it is an overtone of human thought itself. A conjecture of this sort can yield scientia, knowledge, but since it isn't falsifiable, it can't yield science in the modern sense. A work of bricolage is never science, Jared, but it can still astound, make sense, and stimulate thought. It can still impress with its veracity, validity, soundness, and cogency. I see. It seemed to me that, in all this talk, she was somehow trying to screw her courage to the sticking place. I didn't know why this was necessary or how to help, so I just kept nodding and saying, I see, I see. Finally, she lifted her eyes to the trees overhead and said, The moon is up. As if this were a signal, she got up and led me off the path into the woods. Several times in the next few minutes she paused to look around, at what, I don't know, then moved on. Now and then she stopped to pick up something found in the grass. At last she came to a clearing that suited her, and we sat down. She showed me the things she'd collected on the whale: a nail, an old cartridge fuse, a 35mm film canister, a paperclip, a plastic comb, an acorn. At her request, I showed her what I had in my pockets, and she chose a key and a pen to add to the collection. This is what the universe has supplied me with tonight, Jared. We'll have to see what I can make with it. Suddenly, I remembered the fossil ammonite in my jacket pocket. She looked at it with evident surprise when I handed it to her, and I explained that Charles had given it to me to hold on to until we got around to it, which we never had. This will be the centerpiece of our work of bricolage, she said, putting it down between us. Charles had a different purpose in mind for it. I'm pretty sure I know what it was, and we'll get around to that as well. But meanwhile, it'll serve as the piece to which all other pieces in our work must cling. It's the community of life on this planet. Okay. A few minutes ago I said that perhaps, when mental process became human thought, it began to resound with one harmonic that corresponds to what we call religion or awareness of the sacred. I remember. I want you to think of this shell as the community of life. I want you to think that if you know just how to listen to it, this shell will ring out with that harmonic. Can you do that? I can try. There was once a universal religion on this planet, Jared, B said. Were you aware of that? I said I wasn't. The audiences are almost always amazed by this news. Occasionally someone will think I'm referring to what is sometimes called the old religion, paganism, Wicca, but of course I'm not. In the first place, paganism isn't old. It's a farmer's religion through and through, which means it's just a few thousand years old, and of course it was never a universal religion, for the simple reason that farming was never universal. Very often, almost invariably in fact, no one will even recognize the name of the religion I'm talking about, which of course is animism. They've literally never heard of it. I can believe it, I said. Do you know animism? I think you'd better assume I don't. Most people in my position with my training are aware of animism the way modern-day chemists are aware of alchemy. You mean you're aware of animism as a crude and simple-minded precursor of religion, the way chemists are aware of alchemy as a crude and simple-minded precursor of chemistry? Not really religion in the proper sense anymore, then alchemy is chemistry in the proper sense? That's right. She pawed through a collection of oddments and selected the film canister. This is animism, she said, holding it up for my consideration. An empty container as far as you're concerned. Then she dived into her purse and came up with a traveler's sewing kit, from which she extracted a bit of thread long enough to bind film canister and ammonite together. Here, hold on to this, she said, and I took it from her. Tell me about the shell. What do you mean? What is it? Oh, I said, it's the community of life on this planet. And what did I just say to you about it? You said that when mental process became human thought, perhaps this community began to resound with one harmonic that corresponds to what we call religion or awareness of the sacred. If I learn how to listen to it, it'll ring out with that harmonic. Good, but it occurs to me that I've introduced a puzzle here. I said that when mental process, a common phenomena in the animal kingdom, became human thought, it began to ring out with a harmonic that I've identified as awareness of the sacred. But now I'm saying that the community of life rings with that harmonic. Which is it? Human thought or the community of life? I don't find this too puzzling, I told her. I think the community of life began to ring with that harmonic when human thought began to ring with it. Yes, that's what I had in mind. And when this shell begins to resonate with that harmonic, this hollow canister that I've called animism will also begin to resonate, because it's in contact with the shell. Okay, I said. This is what you mean by bricolage? This is what I mean by bricolage. Regarding the number of the gods. Someone inevitably asks why I speak of the gods rather than one god, as if I simply hadn't been informed on this matter and was speaking in error, and I ask them how they happen to know the number of the gods. Sometimes I'm told this is just something everyone knows, the way everyone knows there are 24 hours in a day. Sometimes I'm told God must be one, because this seems to us the most enlightened number for God to be, as if the facts don't count in this particular case. This is like reasoning that the Earth must be the center of the universe because no other place makes as much sense. Most often, of course, I'm told this is an undoubtable number since it's the number given in monotheistic scriptures. Needless to say, I have a rather different take on the whole matter. The number of gods is written nowhere in the universe, Jared, so there's really no way to decide whether that number is 0, as atheists believe, or 1, as monotheists believe, or many, as polytheists believe. The matter is one of complete indifference to me. I don't care whether the number of gods is 1, 0, or 9 billion. If it turned out that the number of gods is 0, this wouldn't cause me to alter a single syllable of what I've said to you. She seemed to want a reaction to this, so I said okay. To speak of gods instead of God has this additional advantage, that I'm spared the embarrassing necessity of forever playing stupid gender games with them. I never have to decide between he and she, him and her. For me, they're just they and them. A not inconsiderable advantage, I observed. She picked up the plastic comb and ran a thumbnail down its teeth. Is it one thing or many? You mean the comb? I don't know. Depends on how you look at it. This comb is the number of gods, Jared. Not something to be added to our work of bricolage, but rather something to be discussed and dismissed. She tossed the comb over her shoulder and out of sight. Where the gods write what they write. The God of revealed religions, and by this I mean religions like yours, taker religions, is a profoundly inarticulate God. No matter how many times he tries, he can't make himself clearly or completely understood. He speaks for centuries to the Jews, but fails to make himself understood. At last he sends his only begotten Son, and his Son can't seem to do any better. Jesus might have sat himself down with a scribe and dictated the answers to every conceivable theological question in absolutely unequivocal terms, but he chose not to, leaving subsequent generations to settle what Jesus had in mind with pogroms, purges, persecutions, wars, the burning stake, and the rack. Having failed through Jesus, God next tried to make himself understood through Muhammad, with limited success, as always. After 1,000 years of silence, he tried again with Joseph Smith, with no better results, or averaging it all out. All God has been able to tell us for sure is that we should do unto others as we'd have them do unto us. What's that? A dozen words? Not much to show for 5,000 years of work, and we probably could have figured out that much for ourselves anyway. To be honest, I'd be embarrassed to be associated with a god as incompetent as that. Your gods have done better? Good heavens, yes, Jared. Immeasurably better, infinitely better. Just look out there. She waved her hand at the world in front of us. What do you see? I see the universe. That's it, Jared. That's where the real gods of the universe write what they write. Your god writes in words. The gods I'm talking about write in galaxies and star systems and planets and oceans and forests and whales and birds and gnats. And what do they write? Well, they write physics and chemistry and biology and astronomy and aerodynamics and meteorology and geology. All of that, of course. But that isn't what you're after, is it? No. What are you after? I'm after what the gods have to write about us. B grabbed my pen and held it up. This is what you're after. This is the law of life. She picked up the ammonite fossil and slipped the pen under the thread that held the film canister in place. What's this? She asked, pointing to the fossil. The community of life on this planet. And this, pointing to the canister, animism. And you see that the law of life is nestled in between the two, touching both the community of life and animism. What is the law of life? I asked her. We'll get to that. That's our main subject tonight. Science versus religion. Religions like yours, revealed religions, are all perceived to be at odds with scientific knowledge, at odds with or irrelevant to. I wonder if you see why. I think it's come to be seen that religion and science are just inherently incompatible. B nodded. Following the usual taker pattern, we are humanity. So if our religions are inherently incompatible with scientific knowledge, then religion itself must be inherently incompatible with scientific knowledge. That's right. But as you'll see, animism is perfectly at home with scientific knowledge. It's much more at home with your sciences than with your religions. Why is that? What's that out there? She asked, making her usual sweeping gesture. That's the world, the universe. That's where the real gods of the universe write what they write, Jared. The gods of your revealed religions write them in books. What does that have to do with animism? Animism looks for truth in the universe, not in books, revelations, and authorities. Science is the same. Though animism and science read the universe in different ways, both have complete confidence in its truthfulness. She poked around among her building blocks, picking out the cartridge fuse, and held it up for my inspection. This is science, she said. Religions like yours, Jared, are skeptical about it, are afraid to use it. They say, suppose we use it and it blows up in our face. Better not trust it. But animism isn't worried about anything that can be revealed about the universe, so science belongs right here beside it. She slid the fuse under the thread holding the film canister to the fossil. Then she asked me to describe what I saw. I said, animism is flanked by the law of life on one side and by science on the other. All three face the community of life. The border. Now I want to make sure we don't lose track of what we set out to do here, Jared. We're investigating a border between almost humans on one side and truly humans on the other. We're doing this because it's my notion that we came to humanity as religious beings. Okay? So let's extend our bricolage to include a little mental landscaping of the area around us. Take a stick and draw a circle around us at a distance of a couple paces. I did as she asked and sat down again. That circle represents the border we're investigating about 3 million years in the past when Australopithecus became Homo. Is that clear? I said it was. I'm sure you understand that this life is imaginary. There was never a day when you would have been able to point to one generation of parents and say, these are Australopithecines, then point to their children and say, these are humans. I understand. We can't know how wide the line itself is. It might be 200 years wide, or 100,000 years wide, or 10,000 years wide. All we know is that on our side of the line there are creatures we feel confident about calling Homo, and on the other side of the line there are creatures we don't feel confident about calling Homo. I understand. I don't know how much you know about all this, so I'll play it safe and point out that the line doesn't correspond to tool use. I mean, you don't have users of tools on this side of the line and non-users on the far side. You have tool users on both sides of the line, we can be virtually certain of this, since even chimpanzees are very well known tool users, and Homo's immediate predecessors were far beyond chimpanzees. I told her I knew all this, but didn't mind playing it safe. The law of life, the hologram. B asked me to describe the state of our work of bricolage. I picked it up and studied it again before beginning. This fossil shell is the community of life on this planet. The religion you call animism is bound up with this community. Something called the law of life is written in the community of life, and this too is bound up with animism. Perhaps it's the work of animism to read the law of life that is written in the community of life. That's an excellent guess, Jared. Go on. Animism perceives itself as allied with science because both seek truth in the universe itself. Good. Now we're ready to spend some time on the law of life. The law of life is like a hologram. Do you know anything about holography? A bit. I was a photography buff in high school, and the holography is basically lensless photography. In ordinary photography, a photographic plate is exposed to light reflected from an object, and an image appears on the plate because a lens intervenes. In holography, a photographic plate is exposed to light reflected from an object, but no image appears on the plate because no lens intervenes. What's recorded on the plate are patterns of light waves received from every part of the photographed object. This is the hologram, and when the hologram is placed in a beam of light, a three-dimensional image of the photographed object appears mid-air where the original object stood. And because every part of it is imprinted with light waves from the whole object, any fragment of the hologram can be used to regenerate the whole image. This is how the law of life is similar to a hologram, Jared. Every fragment of it is imprinted with the whole law. The law of life is what governs life? No. The law of life isn't what governs life, it's what fosters life. And anything that fosters life belongs to the law. I told her an example would help. Here's the law of life for newly hatched ducklings. Latch on to the first thing you see that moves and follow it no matter what. Since the first thing newly hatched ducklings see is ordinarily their mother, they usually latch on to their mother, but they'll latch on to anything that moves. Since their best hope for survival is latching on to their mother, no matter what, you can see that this is the law that fosters life for ducklings. Yes, I can see that. Here is a generalization that can be made about the law of life. Those who follow it tend to become better represented in the gene pool of their species than those who don't follow it. So not all individuals follow the law? The duckling that for one reason or another doesn't receive or respond to the genetic latching on to mom signal is weeded out. It doesn't survive long enough to reproduce. I see. Obviously the law varies in its details from species to species. In ducks, the law is written for ducklings and it reads, stick to mom no matter what. In goats, the law is written for the mother and it reads, suckle only your own. I thought about that for a bit and asked, how suckle only your own fosters life for goats. Let's say white goat and black goat each have a suckling kid. Black goat dies, so her kid comes over to white goat and says, hey, I'm hungry, how about lunch? The best chance white goat's kid has for survival is if its mother says to this stranger, get lost, kid, you're not mine. If white goat says, okay, sure, pull up a teat, she'll be diminishing her own kid's chance for survival, which means her own gene's chance for survival. Yes, I can see that. Here's a more general statement of the law as it's followed by goats. If your resources are of doubtful sufficiently for 2 offspring, then you're better off giving all to one than half to each. Not the law of kindness. I would rather say, not the law of feudal kindness. I think most mothers would rather have one live child than any number of dead ones. She shook her head impatiently and picked up a... Nonetheless, it's true that if there are 2 in conflict, the law favors life over kindness. Those who follow the contrary law, the law that favors kindness over life, will tend to lose their representation in the gene pool of their species. This is because their offspring will tend to survive and reproduce less often than the offspring of those who follow the law that favors life. I understand. On the subject of kindness, I don't know if you know David Brower, one of the century's foremost environmentalists, the founder of the John Muir Institute, Friends of the Earth, and Earth Island Institute. He tells the story of one of his earliest adventures as a naturalist. At the age of 11, he collected some eggs of the western swallowtail butterfly and kept an eye on them as they hatched into caterpillars, which later turned into chrysalids. Finally, the first of the chrysalids began to crack open, and what Brower saw was this. The emerging butterfly struggled out, its abdomen distended by some sort of fluid that was pumped out over its wings as it hung upside down on a twig. Half an hour later, it was ready to fly and took off. As the other chrysalids began to crack, however, Brower decided to make himself useful. He gently eased open the crack to facilitate the butterfly's emergence, and they promptly slid out, walked around, and one by one dropped dead. He had failed to realize that the exertions he had spared the butterfly were essential to their survival, because they triggered the flow of fluid that had to reach their wings. This experience taught him a lesson he was still talking about 70 years later, which appears to be kind and is meant to be kind, can be the reverse of kind. I understand. Among goats, it's the mother that enforces this law. If your resources are of doubtful sufficiency for two, then you're better off giving all to one than half to each. Among eagles and many other bird species, it's enforced by the elder of the two offspring. The female will typically produce 2 eggs a few days apart, which is naturally better survival policy than producing a single egg, but if the first chick survives, it will almost invariably peck or starve the younger chick to death. I said, I guess it was my impression that infanticide was explained as a reaction to overcrowding. Yes, it used to be explained that way, but this argues a perception of evolution that ultimately didn't stand up to close examination. A perception of evolution as promoting what's good for the species, it now seems clear that evolution promotes what's good for the individual, in the sense of assuring the individual's reproductive success, what I've been calling representation in the gene pool. I see. In lions and bears, females will often abandon a litter that has only one survivor, even if this one survivor is in perfect health. This isn't good for the species in any way, but it's good for the individual's lifetime reproductive success. Her representation in the gene pool will definitely improve if she invests exclusively in litters larger than one. I have to admit that this is all news to me. No one can know everything, she said with a shrug. Show me where we're going here. I'm feeling lost again. I can't teach you the whole of the law of life in a single night, Jared. I couldn't teach you the whole of it if we came here every night for a decade. What I can do in a single night is present you with a few pieces of it in the matter of a brocolier, but let's reach for some new pieces in a new direction. The law of life, a mouse burial. She stood up and I started to follow her example, but she told me to stay put. Let's see if I'm lucky tonight, she said, and ducked into the underbrush straight ahead of us. Clearly the huntress in search of a scent, I closed my eyes, grateful for the break. Returning after 10 or 15 minutes from the right, she beckoned me to follow her, which I did with some apprehension. I don't know whether it's a guy thing or a people thing, but I don't like being made to feel like a greenhorn, as I suspected I was going to be. Not more than 10 paces in, she stopped, crouched, and invited me to inspect a bare patch of ground the size of a checkerboard. I identified it at a glance. Dirt. She shook her head impatiently and picked up the twig, which she used as a pointer, showing me something here, there, and everywhere. Looking closely, I spotted clumps of dry grass, twig parts, bits of bark, broken leaves, and more dirt. Don't do this to me, I told her. I'm not Natty Bumpo and never will be. She didn't argue. Instead, she reached her twig over to raise a bunch of low brush and invited me to have a look under it. What it looked like was a dead mouse being buried like a bather at the beach. Only its head showed, nestled in a little mound of dirt. As I watched in the dimmest possible light, the ruffle of dirt around its neck bubbled here and there, and the mouse visibly slid back a millimeter, as if literally sinking into the earth. In an hour or so, B explained, the mouse will be completely underground and out of sight, the work of burying beetles that are digging the soil out from under it. She had lowered the branch, and I asked what she'd been trying to show me in the dirt in front of the brush. She used her twig as a pointer as she tried to show me the signs. The beetles, I'm pretty sure there are just 2 of them, found the mouse's carcass here, but evidently didn't care for this as a burial site, so they carried it to a more sheltered site under that branch. 2 beetles carried the mouse? What they do is burrow under the carcass, then turn over onto their backs and shove it in the direction they want it to go. It's a very laborious process. Once they have it underground, they harden the chamber around it, and while the corpse rots, the female lays her eggs nearby so the larvae will have easy access to the carrion mass once it's opened up. Yum, I said. Oh, there's plenty of competition for this mouse, Jared. Other insects, microbes, many vertebrate scavengers. The flies are especially bothersome because they may have laid their eggs in the mouse's fur before the beetles came along. Fortunately, but not surprisingly, the beetles themselves are supplied with egg sweepers, mites that make their home right on the beetles and that live on flies' eggs. The mouse, the beetles, the mites, and the flies are all inspiring embodiments of the law of life. I thought about this last statement as we made our way back to the clearing. I'm afraid I don't see what makes these creatures embodiments of the law, I told her. The law of life in a single word is abundance. When no more was forthcoming, I asked if she'd elaborate on that a bit. A useful exercise for you would be to go back to the mouse carcass and bring back one of the beetles. Then I'd have you pick off a couple of dozen of the beetle's photoric mites so you could examine them under a microscope. What would I learn from that? You'd learn that each mite, such an inconsiderable creature, is a work of so much delicacy, perfection, and complexity that it makes a digital computer look like a pair of pliers. Then you'd learn something even more amazing that, for all their perfection, they aren't stamped out of a mold. No two of them are alike, no two in all the mighty universe, Jared. And this would be a demonstration of abundance? That's right. This fantastic genetic abundance is life's very secret of success on this planet. We trooped on. After a few minutes, I realized we'd left our clearing far behind. Before long, we were back on the public paths. B said, I haven't done nearly as well as I thought. I hoped I would tonight. Jared, I haven't shown you a tenth as much as I hoped. Tomorrow will be better.